Number 1. Aileen Wuornos. A battered pickup truck idles on the shoulder of a dark Florida highway. Neon motel signs flicker in the distance. A woman in a denim jacket stands beside the road, thumb out, waiting for headlights to slow down. Drivers see a desperate hitchhiker, a woman down on her luck. They do not see a predator counting the seconds until the next car stops. Aileen Wuornos grew up with almost nothing resembling a normal childhood. Her father was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in prison before she was born. Her mother abandoned her as an infant. She was raised by grandparents who beat her and, by her own account, sexually abused her. By 14, she was pregnant and homeless. By 15, she was selling her body along the same highways where she would later kill. Survival became a habit. Rage became a permanent companion. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was working Florida's interstates as a sex worker, drifting between motel rooms and the truck stops where she picked up clients. Between 1989 and 1990, 7 men who picked her up never made it home. She shot each one at close range, in the chest or the head, then took their cash, their jewelry, sometimes their cars, and left the bodies in wooded areas off the highway. She told police it was self-defense, that every man had tried to rape or kill her first. Investigators saw a different pattern. The victims were shot multiple times. Some were found with their pockets turned out. The robberies looked deliberate, not desperate. Prosecutors argued she had crossed a line from survival into predation, hunting the very men who once might have simply been clients. The break in the case came from an abandoned car. A vehicle linked to one of the victims turned up at a pawn shop, sold by a woman using an alias. The detectives traced fingerprints back to Wuornos's known aliases from a decade of arrests. They staked out the biker bars she frequented and finally took her into custody at a rundown tavern outside Daytona Beach. Once in custody, Wuornos confessed on videotape, chain-smoking through the interrogation, oscillating between tears and cold detachment. She insisted every killing was self-defense, then in the same breath described stalking victims with unsettling precision. The tapes became the centerpiece of her trial. A jury found the pattern impossible to reconcile with self-defense and convicted her on multiple counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death and spent her final decade on Florida's death row, her mental state visibly deteriorating. She fired her own attorneys, gave rambling, paranoid interviews, and eventually dropped all appeals, insisting she wanted to die. In October 2002, she was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her last words were a strange, defiant claim that she would return, riding on a spaceship. The drifter who once trusted no one died exactly as she had lived, alone, angry, and utterly convinced the world owed her an apology it would never give. Number 2. Susan Atkins. A knife glints under a full moon in the hills above Los Angeles. Cicadas hum in the canyon brush. Inside a secluded house on Cielo Drive, a young woman is about to die at the hands of someone who, only a few years earlier, sang in a church choir. Susan Atkins arrived in California as a directionless teenager chasing the tail end of the hippie movement. She drifted through communes and drug circles until she found Charles Manson, a small-time ex-convict with a guitar, a stolen theology, and an uncanny gift for controlling vulnerable young women. Manson renamed her Sadie. He convinced her that a coming race war, which he called Helter Skelter, would soon destroy society, and that his followers alone would survive to rule what remained. Atkins abandoned every trace of her old identity and gave herself over completely to his commands. On the night of August 9th, 1969, Manson sent Atkins and 3 other followers to a rented house on Cielo Drive, the former home of a record producer he resented. Inside, They found actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, along with several friends. Atkins held Tate down and stabbed her 16 times while Tate begged for her life and the life of her unborn child. The group left cryptic words written in blood on the front door, a calling card meant to ignite the very race war Manson had promised. For months, investigators struggled to connect the brutal, seemingly random killings to any suspect. The break came from inside the Manson family itself. Atkins, jailed on an unrelated charge, bragged to her cellmates about the murders in vivid, boastful detail, unable to resist describing what she had done. Word reached detectives. The confession, corroborated by physical evidence and other family members who agreed to testify, unraveled the entire conspiracy. At trial, Atkins offered shifting, contradictory accounts, at times expressing remorse, at other times parroting Manson's twisted philosophy from the witness stand. The jury was unmoved. She was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, and sentenced to death, a sentence commuted to life in prison after California briefly abolished capital punishment. Susan Atkins spent nearly 4 decades behind bars, mostly at the California Institution for Women, repeatedly denied parole as she became, along with the rest of the Manson family, a permanent symbol of how easily charisma could curdle into mass murder. In her final years, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. Even dying, shackled to a hospital bed, she was denied compassionate release. She died in prison custody in September 2009. The choir girl who had traded her own life for a stranger's twisted prophecy. Number 3. Lynette Fromme. A red-hooded robe moves through a crowd gathered outside the California State Capitol in Sacramento. Underneath the robe, concealed against her leg, a loaded Colt semi-automatic pistol. Somewhere ahead, President Gerald Ford is about to walk within arm's reach. Lynette Fromme, known to Manson's followers as Squeaky for the sound she made when nervous, had joined Charles Manson's commune as a teenager, drawn in by his attention and his promise of belonging. She remained devoted to him even after his conviction for the Tate LaBianca murders, living for years in ramshackle communes near the courthouse where his trial and later appeals unfolded, insisting to anyone who would listen that Manson had been wrongly persecuted. By the mid-1970s, Fromme had grown increasingly fixated on environmental collapse, another apocalyptic worldview she had absorbed from Manson's teachings. She became convinced that dramatic action was needed to force the government to pay attention. On September 5, 1975, she walked into a crowd in a Sacramento park where President Ford was greeting the public, dressed in her red robe, the pistol strapped to her thigh. As Ford extended his hand to the crowd, Fromme drew the weapon and pointed it directly at him from just a few feet away. A Secret Service agent, close enough to see her hand move, lunged and wedged his thumb between the hammer and the firing pin before she could pull the trigger. Agents wrestled her to the ground as she screamed that the gun hadn't even been loaded, a claim later found to be technically true only because she had failed to chamber a round properly, not because she lacked the intent to kill. She was taken into custody within seconds, offering no resistance once restrained, almost calm, as though the act itself had been the point regardless of the outcome. Investigators found writings in her belongings outlining her devotion to Manson, and her belief that a violent act would draw attention to environmental causes he claimed to champion. A federal jury convicted her of attempting to assassinate the President of the United States. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, a punishment that stunned even some observers given that the gun never fired. She served her sentence largely without incident until 1987, when she briefly escaped from a federal prison in West Virginia, reportedly attempting to reach the dying Manson, who was hospitalized at the time. She was recaptured within days, hiding in the woods less than 2 miles from the prison. Fromme was ultimately released on parole in 2009 after serving 34 years, one of the longest sentences ever served by a woman for an attempted assassination that harmed no one physically. The teenager who once sang for Manson's approval spent her entire adult life paying for a single trigger she never managed to pull. Number 4. Genene Jones. A hospital pediatric ward hums quietly under fluorescent light in San Antonio, Texas. Monitors beep in steady rhythm. Nurse Genene Jones moves between the cribs with practiced, gentle hands, adjusting IV lines, murmuring softly to infants too small to understand the danger standing over them. Jones had trained as a licensed vocational nurse and quickly built a reputation as devoted, almost obsessively attentive to her smallest patients. Parents adored her. Colleagues, however, began noticing an unsettling pattern. Children under her care suffered sudden, unexplained crises, seizures, cardiac arrests, breathing failures, far more often than statistically possible. And when the crisis hit, Jones was almost always the one who dramatically intervened, appearing to save the very child she had just placed in danger, soaking up praise from grieving or grateful families in the aftermath. Investigators later determined she had been injecting infants and toddlers with drugs like succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic with no legitimate use in most pediatric emergencies, and heparin, an anticoagulant capable of triggering fatal bleeding when massively overdosed. Because both drugs metabolized quickly and left few traces on standard toxicology screens of the era, her method went undetected for years across multiple hospitals and clinics. The case that finally broke open involved a toddler named Chelsea McClellan, who suffered a series of mysterious breathing crises at a small Texas clinic where Jones worked after leaving the hospital under a cloud of unspoken suspicion. Chelsea died after one such episode. A pattern of similarly afflicted children at the same clinic, combined with hospital records investigators finally cross-referenced from her earlier employer, led prosecutors to build a case naming her directly. At trial, prosecutors estimated Jones may have harmed as many as 60 children over the course of her career, though only a handful of cases could be conclusively proven with the medical evidence available. She was convicted of murdering Chelsea McClellan and injuring another child, and sentenced to 99 years in prison. For decades, an old Texas law designed to prevent prison overcrowding threatened to release her automatically after serving only a third of her sentence, regardless of the horror of her crimes. As her scheduled release date approached in the 2010s, prosecutors scrambled, digging through decades-old hospital records to file new indictments tied to additional infant deaths from the early 1980s, securing new convictions that kept her locked away. Genene Jones remains imprisoned today, one of the most prolific medical killers in American history, a caretaker who turned the safest place in a hospital into a hunting ground. Number 5. Andrea Yates. A modest suburban home outside Houston, Texas, sits quiet on a June morning in 2001. Sunlight filters through drawn curtains. Inside, a mother moves through the house with eerie calm, filling the bathtub with water while her 5 children, ranging from 6 months to 7 years old, remain upstairs, unaware of what is about to happen. Andrea Yates had once been a bright, high-achieving nurse before devoting herself entirely to raising her growing family. Beneath the surface of a devoted homeschooling mother, she battled severe postpartum depression and psychosis for years, hospitalized multiple times, prescribed and later taken off powerful antipsychotic medication against the advice of at least one treating physician. Family members later testified they had begged doctors and her husband to recognize how dangerously fragile her mental state had become. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, alone in the house after her husband left for work, Yates methodically drowned each of her 5 children in the bathtub, one by one, the older children apparently aware of what was happening to their younger siblings before their own turn came. When she finished, she called 911 herself, then called her husband, repeating only the words, "It's time," offering no further explanation until police arrived. She confessed immediately and in full detail, telling investigators she believed Satan had possessed her and that she needed to kill her children to save their souls before they could be damned by her own failures as a mother. The case ignited a fierce national debate over postpartum mental illness, medication, and the legal boundaries of the insanity defense. Her first trial ended in a conviction for capital murder and a sentence of life in prison. A verdict later overturned on appeal after it emerged that a key expert witness had given testimony containing a significant factual error about an episode of a television show he claimed had inspired her actions. A second trial, presented with a fuller picture of her documented psychiatric history, found her not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea Yates was committed to a state mental health facility in Texas, where she remains today, permanently confined but treated as a patient rather than a conventional inmate. Her case remains one of the most cited in American discussions of maternal mental illness, a tragedy that forced courts, doctors, and the public to reckon with how far untreated psychosis can travel before anyone intervenes. Number 6. Lynndie England. A dim cell-block corridor inside Abu Ghraib prison, Iraq, glows under harsh fluorescent light. Naked, hooded detainees are stacked in a human pyramid against a concrete wall. Standing beside them, a young American soldier grins for the camera, cigarette in her mouth, thumbs up, a leash looped around the neck of a man crouched on the floor behind her. Lynndie England was a 21-year-old Army reservist from rural West Virginia, assigned to military police duties at the Abu Ghraib detention facility during the Iraq War. She had enlisted partly for tuition benefits, partly out of small-town boredom, with no history suggesting the events that would soon make her name globally infamous. In early 2004, hundreds of photographs surfaced showing American soldiers physically and psychologically abusing detainees at the prison, forcing them into humiliating sexual positions, threatening them with dogs, subjecting them to mock executions. England appeared in some of the most widely circulated images, smiling and posing as though the abuse were an amusing photo opportunity rather than a war crime. The photographs detonated internationally, becoming a defining symbol of controversy surrounding the American occupation of Iraq and severely damaging the country's standing abroad. England later testified that she had been in a relationship with a fellow soldier, Specialist Charles Grainer, widely identified as the ringleader who orchestrated and directed much of the abuse, and that she had gone along with his instructions partly out of romantic attachment and partly out of a desire to fit in with her unit. Prosecutors argued that regardless of her motivations, she had actively and enthusiastically participated, rather than merely following orders under duress. A military court-martial convicted her on multiple counts, including conspiracy, maltreatment of detainees, and committing an indecent act. She was sentenced to 3 years in a military prison and a dishonorable discharge, ultimately serving roughly half of that sentence at a facility in Fort Worth, Texas, before her release. The photographs never faded from public memory the way England's own notoriety eventually did. Investigations, congressional hearings, and international condemnation followed for years afterward, though many of the officers overseeing the prison faced far lighter consequences than the young reservist whose face became the scandal's most recognizable image. Lynndie England remains, for most Americans, the first face that comes to mind at the mention of Abu Ghraib, a 21-year-old whose thumbs-up photograph outlived every official investigation that followed it. Number 7. Betty Broderick. An upscale San Diego neighborhood sleeps in darkness at 4 in the morning. Streetlights glow over manicured lawns. A station wagon accelerates suddenly and crashes through the wrought iron gate of a large home, its headlights cutting across the driveway before the engine goes silent. Betty Broderick had spent nearly 2 decades supporting her husband Dan through medical school and then law school, working, raising 4 children, and building the foundation of a prosperous life, while he built his career as a successful malpractice attorney. When that career finally paid off, Dan left her for his young paralegal, Linda Colcana, whom he later married. The divorce that followed was bitter and prolonged, dragging through the courts for years as Betty, representing herself for stretches after exhausting her legal fees, felt increasingly humiliated by a system she believed favored her wealthy, well-connected ex-husband. She waged what she later called psychological warfare, leaving furious answering machine messages, driving her car through his front door on one occasion, vandalizing his home repeatedly. Friends and family watched her spiral from a spurned wife into someone consumed entirely by rage and public humiliation, unable to move past the betrayal even years after the marriage legally ended. In the early morning hours of November 5, 1989, Broderick used a spare key to enter the home where Dan and Linda now lived as husband and wife. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom with a revolver and shot them both as they slept, killing them almost instantly. She then called police herself and turned herself in without resistance. At trial, her defense argued years of psychological abuse and public humiliation had pushed her into a state of diminished capacity, a crime of passion born from betrayal rather than premeditation. Prosecutors countered that she had planned the killing carefully, choosing the hour, the entry method, and bringing a loaded weapon with clear intent. After one mistrial, a second jury convicted her of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Her case became a national media sensation, spawning television movies and books that debated whether she was a victim of a broken system or a calculated killer who simply refused to let go. Now in her 70s, Betty Broderick remains incarcerated in a California prison, repeatedly denied parole, still insisting decades later that the system that failed to protect her marriage bears as much responsibility for that night as she does. Number 8. Diane Downs. A dark rural road outside Springfield, Oregon, cuts through farmland under a moonless sky in May 1983. A car speeds erratically toward the nearest hospital, a woman gripping the wheel with one bleeding arm, 3 children slumped in the back seat behind her. Diane Downs arrived at the emergency room that night with a story that seemed almost too strange to invent. She told police a shaggy-haired stranger had flagged her down on the empty road, then opened fire on her and her children without warning or apparent motive, wounding all 3 kids and grazing her own arm before she managed to drive away and escape. Investigators initially treated her as a victim of a random, horrifying attack, launching a search for the mysterious gunman she described. The story began unraveling almost immediately under forensic scrutiny. The pattern and angle of the wounds did not match an attacker firing into the car from outside. Downs' own injury appeared far less severe than her children's, inconsistent with someone caught in genuine crossfire. As her surviving children recovered enough to communicate, their accounts, delivered haltingly through drawings and gestures long before they could speak coherently again, began pointing directly at their own mother rather than any stranger. Investigators eventually established a chilling motive. Downs had been pursuing a relationship with a married co-worker who had made clear he did not want the responsibility of children, hers or anyone else's, in his life. Prosecutors argued she had decided her children stood between her and the relationship she wanted, and resolved to eliminate that obstacle entirely. At trial, the physical evidence, combined with her own children's halting testimony, proved devastating to her defense. One daughter, permanently paralyzed by her wounds, testified in court against her own mother. A jury convicted Downs of murder in the death of one child and attempted murder in the wounding of the other 2. She was sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 additional years. In 1987, she briefly escaped from an Oregon prison, evading capture for roughly a week before being recaptured. Diane Downs remains incarcerated today, repeatedly denied parole, having never publicly accepted responsibility for a crime that remains one of the clearest documented cases of a mother turning violently against her own children in pursuit of a man who never wanted them. Number 9. Dorothea Puente. A pale yellow Victorian boarding house sits quietly on F Street in Sacramento, California. Flowers carefully tended along a neat garden path. Neighbors pass by and wave. Dorothea Puente, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, waves back, tending her roses in the afternoon sun. Puente ran the boarding house as a refuge for society's most overlooked people: the elderly, the disabled, and those struggling with addiction, offering them a room and home-cooked meals in exchange for their monthly government disability and Social Security checks. She had a lengthy criminal history involving fraud and, unknown to her tenants, at least one prior conviction connected to drugging vulnerable boarders. But her warm demeanor and genuine charm kept new residents and new suspicion-free landlord licenses coming her way. In November 1988, a social worker grew concerned after being unable to locate one of Puente's tenants, a mentally disabled man who had simply seemed to vanish. The search led investigators to the boarding house property itself, and eventually to freshly disturbed soil in the neat garden Puente maintained so carefully. Over the following days, police exhumed 7 bodies buried across the property, several of them former tenants who had supposedly moved away months or years earlier. Investigators determined Puente had been drugging her boarders, sometimes fatally, with combinations of prescription sedatives, then continuing to cash their disability and Social Security checks for months after their deaths, all while maintaining the fiction to neighbors, family members, and government caseworkers that her missing tenants had simply relocated. She buried them in her own garden, tending the flowers above their graves as neighbors admired her green thumb. At trial, prosecutors linked her directly to 3 of the deaths through toxicology and financial records, though the jury deadlocked on several additional counts due to decomposition limiting conclusive cause of death findings. She was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente maintained her innocence for the rest of her life, insisting her tenants had died of natural causes and that she had simply continued cashing their checks out of financial necessity rather than malice. She died in prison in March 2017 at the age of 82. The landlady with the sweetest smile in the neighborhood, her garden forever remembered not for its flowers, but for what investigators found buried beneath them. Number 10. Patty Hearst. A grainy black and white surveillance image freezes a moment in time inside a San Francisco bank. A young woman in fatigues grips an assault rifle, sweeping it across the room as tellers and customers drop to the floor. The photograph would soon appear on the front page of nearly every newspaper in America. Patty Hearst was 19 years old, granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, living a quiet college life in Berkeley, California, when she was violently kidnapped from her apartment in February 1974 by members of a small, self-styled revolutionary group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army. She was held blindfolded in a closet for weeks, subjected to what she and her later defense would describe as psychological and sexual abuse, isolation, and constant ideological indoctrination. Roughly 2 months into her captivity, Hearst announced through a recorded message that she had adopted a new name, Tanya, and had chosen to join her captor's revolutionary cause of her own free will. Weeks later, the surveillance footage from a San Francisco bank robbery showed her armed and apparently willing, participating actively in a crime alongside the very people who had abducted her. The nation watched, stunned, unable to agree on whether they were witnessing a hostage forced to perform under threat of death, or a genuine convert who had embraced her captor's cause. Hearst remained on the run with the group for more than a year following the robbery, present for additional criminal activity before her eventual capture by the FBI in San Francisco in September 1975. At trial, her defense argued she had been the victim of a documented psychological phenomenon, essentially brainwashed through prolonged terror, isolation, and abuse into complying with her captors to survive. Prosecutors countered that regardless of how the process began, her actions during the robbery reflected willing participation in violent crime. A jury ultimately rejected the brainwashing defense and convicted her of armed bank robbery. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but served less than 2 before President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence in 1979, citing the extraordinary and disturbing circumstances of her original kidnapping. 2 decades later, in 2001, President Bill Clinton granted her a full and unconditional pardon. Patty Hearst's case remains one of the strangest and most debated transformations in American criminal history. A wealthy young heiress transformed by trauma, or by choice, or by some tangled combination of both, into an armed bank robber, and eventually, once again, into a free woman living quietly outside the spotlight that once made her infamous.